3 months ago, I signed the final papers a widow never wants to touch. I believed the folded flag, the cold condolences, and the perfectly stamped report. Then my sister spotted a familiar face in a random 10-second video, and suddenly, his death reeked of a setup. The nightmare is not just that my husband might be alive, it is that someone built their future on his fake grave. Now, I will tear it all down. My name is Brooklyn Moore. I am 33 years old, and until a freezing, rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in November, I believed my life was grounded in absolute certainty. I lived in a quiet, manicured neighborhood in Colorado Springs, working as an operations manager at Ridgeline Civic Systems, a logistics technology firm. My days were spent optimizing supply chains and ensuring corporate data streams flowed without interruption. My husband, Evan, brought a different kind of intensity to our home. A former soldier who had transitioned into private defense contracting, Evan provided technical support for overseas military operations. He was a man of quiet strength, measured habits, and fierce loyalty. We had a life built on solid foundations and predictable routines. Then the doorbell rang, and that foundation shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. The rain was coming down in thick, gray sheets, turning the world outside my front window into a cold blur. I opened the door to find two men in immaculate dark uniforms standing on my porch. I stared at the heavy drops of water pooling around their perfectly polished black shoes, unable to look up at their faces. When they finally stepped into the foyer, all the oxygen vanished from my house. They delivered the news with a practiced, somber precision that felt like a physical blow to the chest. Evan had been killed in a botched tactical operation overseas. The environment was described as chaotic, completely compromised, and ultimately devastating. The most agonizing part of their rehearsed speech came wrapped in a steady, bureaucratic tone. His remains could not be brought home intact. The sheer, unmitigated violence of the event had made a standard repatriation impossible. There would be no body to view, no final moment to hold his hand. I stood rooted to the hardwood floor, utterly paralyzed. The walls of my own hallway felt like they were closing in on me. Yet, even as the deafening roar of raw shock echoed in my ears, a colder, deeply rational part of my brain flickered to life. I watched the two casualty notification officers closely. They recited their lines with flawless cadence, like actors who had performed this exact tragic play 1,000 times before. When I desperately pushed for details about Evan's specific support unit or the exact coordinates of the system failure, they immediately deflected. They offered vague, sanitized references to classified protocols and ongoing security assessments. Even more unsettling was their physical demeanor. When I choked back a sob and asked about his personal effects, the taller officer noticeably broke eye contact. His gaze drifted away, fixing on the baseboards behind me. They were hiding something behind their crisp uniforms and sympathetic, rehearsed nods. Within 48 hours, my sanctuary transformed into a morbid staging ground. The dining room table was completely buried under mountains of wilting white lilies and heavy-scented roses. Neighbors, distant relatives, and acquaintances marched through my front door in a ceaseless, suffocating parade, bearing foil-wrapped casseroles and casting sorrowful glances in my direction. My phone vibrated endlessly, accumulating hundreds of text messages I could not bring myself to read. But the more people crowded into my living space, the more intensely isolated I felt. Evan's tragic death did not feel like a deeply personal loss to them. It felt like a societal process. I was suddenly the grieving widow, a designated role in a terrible play, and everyone else was simply executing their assigned duties in my tragedy. I resented the sheer efficiency of their mourning. I began existing in a hollow, mechanical state, suspended somewhere between functioning adulthood and total nervous collapse. I returned to my office at Ridgeline Civic Systems far too soon. I buried myself in complex supply chain data and vendor contracts for 8 to 10 hours a day, simply because the numbers made sense when absolutely nothing else did. I moved like a programmed machine during the daylight hours, nodding at coworkers who treated me like fragile glass. But at night, the silence of our empty house was suffocating. I would sit on the edge of our unmade bed at 2 in the morning, playing his old voicemails over and over on a continuous loop, desperate to anchor myself to the warm resonance of his voice. I spent countless hours sitting on the dark floor of his closet, pressing his flannel shirts tightly against my face. I needed to inhale the familiar, comforting scent of our lavender fabric softener mixed with the lingering notes of his cedar cologne. I was searching the shadows for a ghost that stubbornly refused to materialize. His family offered no real solace, only friction. His mother sat rigidly on my living room sofa, her eyes dry and uncompromising, insisting that I needed to accept the harsh truth and find a way to move on. To her, closure was a mandatory destination I was failing to reach, but it was Evan's older brother who truly made my blood run cold. Barely 2 weeks after the military notification, while we were standing in my kitchen supposedly discussing memorial arrangements, he cornered me. He did not ask how I was coping or if I was eating. Instead, he leaned casually against the granite counter and asked if I had initiated the claims for the military death benefits and the private life insurance policies. He tried to mask it as brotherly concern, suggesting I needed to secure my financial future immediately, but the underlying urgency in his tone was undeniable. A cold, sickening chill crawled up the back of my neck. It was entirely too soon. Why was he so desperately eager for me to cash in on his brother's tragic end? Then the memorial box arrived. The contracting agency sent a small, surprisingly heavy cardboard package containing the few personal items allegedly recovered from the blast site. My hands shook violently as I sliced through the thick packing tape. Inside, neatly sorted into plastic evidence bags, were his metal dog tags, a partially scorched leather wallet, and a single silver chain. I dumped the contents onto the kitchen island, sifting through the charred remnants again and again. My heart pounded against my ribs. Something vital was missing. Evan wore a heavy matte black titanium wedding watch. I had given it to him on our very first anniversary, and he never took it off. He wore it to shower. He wore it to sleep, and he certainly wore it on every single deployment. It was his permanent anchor to me. But the watch was completely absent from the inventory. I stared at the empty space on the counter, committing the glaring absence to my permanent memory. I did not mention the missing titanium watch to the military liaison, nor did I breathe a word of it to his brother. I kept that sharp piece of the puzzle locked tight inside my chest. A full month later, the official incident report finally arrived in the mail. I sat alone at my dining table, armed with a yellow highlighter and the relentless analytical mind that made me a top operations manager. I read every single word, analyzing it as if it were a flawed corporate logistics manifest. I mapped out the reported timeline, the logistics of the tactical extraction, and the supply routes mentioned in the brief. And the more deeply I read, the colder my hands became. The report was entirely too clean. In my professional world of logistics and complex operations, catastrophic failures are incredibly messy. They leave a wide trail of disjointed data, conflicting timestamps, and chaotic margins of error. This military report had absolutely none of that. It read exactly like a finalized corporate audit, perfectly sanitized and meticulously balanced. There were absolutely no gray areas, no unanswered variables. It was a sterile narrative engineered specifically to close a file, not a truthful account of a brutal disaster. I tried with everything I had to force myself to accept the finality of it. I repeatedly told myself that immense grief makes people paranoid, that my desperate, broken mind was simply searching for non-existent patterns in the ashes to avoid saying a final goodbye. I went through the daily motions of the broken widow, wearing dark clothes, thanking neighbors for their misplaced sympathies, and letting the entire world believe I had surrendered to the tragedy. But deep down, beneath the crushing, suffocating weight of the loss, a stubborn, undeniable instinct refused to be buried. My husband's death was presented as a flawlessly executed equation, but the foundational variables were entirely wrong. The pieces simply did not fit together. A terrifying realization began to take root in the back of my mind. The story was a fabrication, Something massive and dangerous was hiding in the dark, and I could feel it staring right back at me. Exactly 90 days had passed since my entire existence was neatly packed into a sanitized, government-issued narrative. I had spent those 3 months learning how to breathe inside a vacuum. Then, on a Tuesday evening, my phone vibrated against the granite kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed my sister's name. Sloan Mercer is a high-end wedding photographer, a woman whose entire livelihood depends on her ability to capture the fleeting, microscopic truths people try to hide behind polished smiles. She is sharp, fiercely direct, and entirely immune to sentimentality. When I answered, I expected her usual rapid-fire complaining about difficult clients or terrible venue lighting. Instead, I heard a ragged, unsteady intake of breath. "Brooklyn," she said. Her voice was trembling, stripped entirely of its usual armor. "Get in your car. Come to my studio right now." I asked her what was wrong, my mind instantly jumping to a medical emergency or a car accident. She cut me off before I could finish the sentence. She refused to elaborate, simply repeating her demand with a terrifying, brittle urgency. I grabbed my keys and drove the 15 miles across town in a blind, heart-pounding panic. When I unlocked the heavy steel door to her downtown loft, the main studio lights were completely extinguished. The only illumination came from the harsh, cold glare of her massive dual editing monitors in the center of the room. Sloan was pacing frantically behind her desk, her hands buried in her messy hair. She did not say a word as I approached. She simply pointed a shaking finger at the left screen. It was a social media post, a low-resolution video clip uploaded by a tiny, obscure civilian relief organization operating near a volatile Eastern European border. The entire clip was barely 10 seconds long. It showed a chaotic, mud-soaked encampment where volunteers were hurriedly distributing unmarked boxes of medical supplies and heavy bags of grain to a line of desperate-looking locals. It was the kind of grim, everyday footage that users scroll past without a second thought. "Look at the left corner," Sloan whispered, her voice cracking. "I am going to play it at quarter speed." She hit the spacebar. The grainy footage crawled forward, my eyes strained against the pixelated darkness on the edge of the frame. There, half hidden behind the open flap of a canvas medical tent, a man was kneeling in the dirt, wrapping a thick white gauze bandage around a teenager's lacerated arm. He was gaunt, his collarbones jutting sharply against a filthy olive-green shirt. His face was obscured by an overgrown, unkempt beard and a layer of grime. Sloan paused the video exactly at the 6-second mark. She grabbed her mouse and drew a crop box around the kneeling man, magnifying the image until the pixels began to blur at the edges. The air vanished from my lungs. The floor beneath my boots felt like it was dissolving. A wife knows the fundamental architecture of the man she loves. I knew the exact, sloping tension in his shoulders. I knew the specific way he carried his weight, anchoring himself solidly on his right heel when he focused on a physical task, but it was the granular details that violently tore my reality apart. As the man turned his head slightly to speak to the boy, the harsh overhead light caught the side of his face. There, just above his left temple, was a pale, crescent-shaped scar. And as Sloan let the video play for another 2 painful seconds, the man finished securing the bandage and instinctively flexed his left wrist inward. It was a highly specific, unconscious physical tic, born from an old college baseball injury, a movement I had watched him do 1,000 times over morning coffee. It was Evan. My entire body went ice cold. A violent tremor started in my hands and traveled straight up to my chest. He was thinner, battered, and living in the dirt of a forgotten border town, but it was undoubtedly my husband. The man the government had declared definitively, irrefutably dead, was breathing on a monitor in my sister's studio. Sloan silently scrolled down to the caption beneath the video. The text, roughly translated from a regional dialect, was maddeningly vague. It described a makeshift civilian aid network and casually mentioned a wounded American, saved by local villagers in the woods months prior, who was now assisting their medical triage unit to repay his debt. "We have to call them," I choked out, the words tasting like copper in my dry mouth. For the next 4 hours, the studio turned into a frantic war room. We abandoned all reason and operated on pure, raw adrenaline. We sent dozens of direct messages to the organization's social media pages across 3 different platforms. We drafted urgent emails in English and used software to translate them into the local language, begging for any information about the American volunteer. Sloan managed to dig up a buried international contact number listed on an archived version of their website. I dialed it. The line rang, echoing hollowly across the globe, before terminating in a dead, automated tone. I redialed. I called it 20 times, then 30 times. No one answered. The silence that followed was the most agonizing torture I had ever endured. Grieving a dead husband is a heavy, crushing weight, but it is finite. You know where the boundaries of the pain are, but this sudden, violent injection of hope was excruciating. It felt like bleeding out. If he was alive, where had he been? Why was he in a refugee camp? Why had he not found a single telephone to call his wife? The unanswered questions began to rot in my brain, turning hope into a deeply paranoid terror. By midnight, Sloan forced me to go home, promising to keep a vigil by her screens. I walked into my dark, silent house, but I did not go to the bedroom. I went straight to my home office. I bypassed the stacks of unopened condolence cards and unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I pulled out the official military casualty report. I spread the thick, immaculately typed pages across the surface of my oak desk. I stared at the authoritative government seals, the signatures of high-ranking officials, the definitive, clinical language describing a catastrophic system failure with zero possibility of survival. I stood in the dead silence of my home, the cold reality of the situation finally crystallizing in my mind. I placed my palms flat against the cold wood of the desk and spoke aloud for the first time, testing the weight of the truth. Either my husband is alive, and this piece of paper is a mistake, I whispered to the empty room, or someone went to extraordinary, highly illegal lengths to ensure I believed he was dead. At exactly 1:45 in the morning, the sharp, artificial chime of a new email shattered the quiet. I lunged for my laptop. It was a reply from the encrypted Proton Mail account associated with the Civilian Relief Coordinator. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to use both of them to guide the cursor to open the message. The text was brief, defensive, and written in broken, cautious English. The coordinator absolutely refused to confirm the identity of the man in the video, citing the severe security risks of their region. They claimed the volunteer was a private individual who had arrived half dead and owed nothing to the outside world. I scanned the short paragraph, my heart sinking, until my eyes locked onto the final sentence. It read, "The American lost all his identification papers in the incident, and he has made it explicitly clear to our camp leaders that he does not want to meet with any official representatives." I read that sentence 5 times. Then 10 times. The desperate, frantic wife inside me vanished, instantly replaced by the cold, analytical operations manager who spent her life dissecting logistical anomalies. That single sentence fundamentally changed the entire landscape of my nightmare. If Evan had simply suffered a traumatic brain injury, if he was suffering from severe amnesia or lingering physical trauma, he would not know to actively fear the authorities. A confused, wounded soldier without a passport would view a government representative as his only ticket to salvation. He would run toward an embassy, not hide from it. He was not avoiding strangers. He was deliberately, strategically avoiding official channels. Evan was hiding. And a man with my husband's tactical training only hides in the mud of a foreign border when he knows exactly who is hunting him. Within 36 hours of reading that cryptic email, we were airborne. I did not bother to manufacture a polite excuse for his family. I did not text his brother, nor did I call his mother to check on her grieving process. I simply opened my laptop, typed a rigid, 2-sentence email to Human Resources stating that an unforeseen family emergency required an immediate, indefinite leave of absence, and then I closed the screen. I packed a single dark canvas duffel bag. Into it went the few tangible anchors of my former reality: a small leather photo album, my platinum wedding band safely tucked into a zippered pocket, a heavily folded copy of the government casualty report, and a solid state drive containing every encrypted communication Evan had ever sent me before he vanished into the smoke. We navigated 4 separate connecting flights, crossing multiple time zones and trading the polished, sterile concourses of international hubs for increasingly dilapidated, rain-swept airstrips. The final leg of our journey was a brutal, bone-rattling drive in the back of a rusted transport truck. We arrived in a bleak, gray-washed border town where the air hung heavy with the acrid scent of wet ash and diesel fuel. Our fixer, a silent local man Sloan had somehow bribed through a web of encrypted applications, led us through a labyrinth of narrow, mud-slicked alleys. We finally stopped in front of a crumbling stone structure. It was an old chapel, its stained glass windows long shattered and boarded over with rotting plywood, now repurposed as a chaotic triage center for displaced civilians. I stepped over the threshold, the heavy wooden doors groaning in protest behind me. The nave of the church was a blur of frantic motion, filled with metal cots, hanging plastic tarps, and the low, desperate hum of foreign voices. I scanned the dim interior, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and then the chaotic motion of the entire room seemed to freeze into a static tableau. I saw him. He was standing near the remnants of the stone altar, sorting through a wooden crate of iodine bottles. I stopped breathing. The cinematic, tearful reunion I had hallucinated during those endless, turbulent flights across the Atlantic, the part where he turns, drops everything in shock, and pulls me fiercely against his chest, evaporated the second our eyes met. He looked up, the color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a polished marble statue. He did not rush toward me. He froze like a hunted animal caught in the blinding crosshairs of a sniper rifle. His first reaction was not joy, nor was it relief. It was pure, visceral, unadulterated panic. Before I could even force his name past my lips, he crossed the stone floor in 3 massive strides, grabbed my forearm with a grip hard enough to leave bruises, and dragged me into a suffocatingly small, windowless supply closet. He slammed the heavy oak door shut, plunging us into near-total darkness, smelling of bleach and damp earth. "You cannot be here," he hissed. The voice belonged to my husband, but the cadence was erratic and frantic, like a stranger's. "They still think I am dead. We have to let them keep thinking that a little longer." Those words hit me like physical blows to the stomach. My blood turned to ice. The overwhelming surge of adrenaline that had sustained me for thousands of miles crashed headlong into a wall of profound, suffocating betrayal. I had crossed the world, dragging my shattered, grieving heart behind me, fully expecting to resurrect my husband. Instead, I was standing in the dark with a paranoid ghost. The air between us felt instantly toxic. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached, and I violently shoved his hand off my arm. He leaned back against the rough plaster wall, his chest heaving, and the horrific reality of the past 90 days began to spill out of him in jagged, broken fragments. The tactical operation had not failed due to insurgent activity or bad intelligence. It had been intentionally sabotaged. It was betrayed from the inside. Weeks before the catastrophic explosion, Evan had stumbled across highly restricted, unauthorized logistical routing codes buried deep within the defense network architecture. He had uncovered undeniable proof that millions of dollars in highly classified tactical equipment were not being destroyed in combat or lost in transit, as the official logs claimed. They were being systematically diverted, stolen, and sold to the highest bidder. The devastating blast that wiped out his entire team was not tragic collateral damage. It was a calculated erasure. The architects of the theft needed to bury the truth, and a pile of American casualties provided the absolute perfect cover. He had been thrown clear of the primary kill zone by the sheer force of the shockwave, dragged broken and bleeding into the dense tree line by a pair of local scavengers while the wreckage burned. When he finally regained consciousness days later, and managed to patch into a secure communications relay to signal his survival back to military command, the response was not a rescue chopper. It was a localized, highly coordinated sweep of the exact grid coordinates he had just broadcasted from. Someone deep inside the command structure, someone with high-level clearance, was actively hunting the lone survivor. To stay alive, he had to become the corpse they reported. I stared at him through the gloom, my vision blurring with furious, scalding tears. I heard his logistical nightmare. My analytical mind understood the brutal tactical necessity of his disappearance, but the wife in me was screaming in agony. 3 months, I whispered, my voice raw and trembling, bouncing off the claustrophobic walls. 90 days. Evan, I picked out a casket. I stood in the rain and let your mother cry on my shoulder. I packed up your clothes. I lived in a nightmare. And you were breathing the entire time. He reached out toward me, his hands shaking violently, but I stepped back, my spine hitting the metal shelving behind me. If I called you, he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. If I sent a single encrypted ping to your phone or an email to your laptop, you would be the very first asset they utilized to hunt me down. They would have wiretapped you, followed you, monitored every keystroke. My absolute silence was the only thing keeping a target off your back. I did not forgive him. The emotional damage he had inflicted, even if it was a desperate maneuver to save my life, was a chasm entirely too wide to bridge in a dusty closet halfway across the globe. The betrayal stung like acid. But as I watched the terrified, haunted man standing in front of me, the personal tragedy began to rapidly metastasize into something far colder and significantly more dangerous. The paralyzing grief that had suffocated me for a quarter of a year suddenly hardened. It crystallized into a sharp, lethal spear of pure clarity. This was no longer just a pathetic story about a broken marriage and a staged death. It was a massive, highly orchestrated corporate and military cover-up. Someone back home, sitting safely in a comfortable leather chair, had profited immensely from the blood of his team and the systematic destruction of my sanity. They had turned my mourning into a convenient administrative step in their embezzlement scheme. And as I looked at the man who was supposed to be dead, I realized that my tears were finally gone. Only the rage remained, precise and calculating. Evan led me away from the heavy oak door, deeper into the suffocating gloom of the windowless storage room. He did not offer any more apologies, nor did he attempt to bridge the physical distance between us. Instead, he reached beneath a pile of moldy canvas tarps and pulled out a rugged military-grade tablet. The screen illuminated his hollow face in a harsh, pale blue glow. He was no longer speaking to his grieving wife. He was delivering a briefing. And as I stared at the illuminated screen, my tears evaporated entirely. They were instantly replaced by the cold, sterile focus I usually reserved for dissecting massive supply chain failures at Ridgeline Civic Systems. He opened a series of heavily encrypted, nested folders. The files contained hundreds of pages of supply manifests, digital procurement contracts, and offshore routing numbers. He walked me through the architecture of a massive, bloody lie. The highly classified tactical equipment meant for his team, the advanced optics, the encrypted communication arrays, the heavy weaponry, had never actually reached the combat zone. Instead, the invoices were systematically inflated by 300%. Entire shipments were quietly rerouted from military transport planes to a complex network of untraceable shell companies. The digital signatures authorizing these ghost shipments were flawlessly forged, bypassing multiple layers of federal oversight. His team had not been killed by enemy combatants. They had been executed to balance a fraudulent ledger. One corporate entity appeared repeatedly at the absolute center of the financial web: Brant Mercer Defense Logistics. It was the exact private contractor that had hired Evan to audit their external security networks just 6 months prior. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracking the executive hierarchy listed in a leaked internal memo. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Listed as the vice president of global operations was a man named Nolan Price. My mind viciously snapped back to a summer barbecue 4 years ago. Nolan Price was a fraternity brother and longtime drinking companion of Grant Moore, Evan's older brother. He was the same brother who had cornered me in my kitchen a mere 2 weeks after the casualty officers left. I vividly remembered Grant leaning against my granite counter, practically vibrating with nervous energy as he pushed me to finalize the life insurance payouts and military survivor benefits. He had masked it as brotherly concern, telling me I needed to sign the release forms immediately to secure my financial future. Now, viewing that conversation through the lens of stolen military hardware and a staged massacre, Grant was not simply an insensitive relative rushing my grief. He was a potential accessory. The realization was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, threatening to crack my ribs. Evan rubbed his face, deep exhaustion radiating from every line on his skin. He confessed one final, terrifying detail. Just 72 hours before his unit deployed into the fatal ambush, he realized he was being actively monitored by his own command structure. Knowing the internal network was compromised, he configured a digital dead man's switch. He scheduled an encrypted email containing the core financial ledgers to automatically send to a secure domestic address if he failed to input a cancellation code within 5 days. But he had been entirely off the grid, bleeding out in a foreign forest, unable to check if the payload had successfully delivered or who might have intercepted it. He had sent it to an old, shared webmail account. It was an address I had set up with my sister, Sloane, nearly 8 years ago for coordinating our mother's medical care, an account we rarely, if ever, monitored anymore. I threw open the closet door and grabbed Sloane from the chapel nave, dragging her into the back room. We huddled around her sleek silver laptop in the dim light. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, utilizing diagnostic software to bypass standard security protocols and access the administrative login history of that forgotten email account. The inbox was completely empty. The encrypted payload Evan sent was gone, but Sloane dug deep into the server backend and extracted the access logs. Someone had remotely logged into that specific inbox from a masked server located in the United States. I looked at the exact timestamp of the intrusion. All the oxygen was punched completely out of my lungs. The illegal access occurred exactly 6 hours after the 2 uniformed officers stood on my front porch and handed me the folded flag. The entire narrative shifted violently on its axis. What I was looking at was no miracle survival story. It was an active conspiracy. The people behind Brant Mercer Defense Logistics, and potentially my own brother-in-law, knew about the data leak. They knew Evan had a dead man's switch. They had actively scrubbed the evidence from our digital lives while I was sitting on my living room floor, paralyzed by fresh grief. They needed the official military narrative to hold up to public scrutiny. They needed Evan definitively dead on paper, and they desperately needed me to bury him without asking a single question, thereby legally closing the book on their massive embezzlement scheme. I was not just a tragic bystander. I was the final, necessary piece of their cover-up. For the first time since the rain-soaked Tuesday when my life ended, I stopped crying. The deep, agonizing well of sorrow dried up instantly, replaced by a glacial, calculated rage. I am an operations manager. I dismantle complex systems for a living. I identify structural weaknesses. I isolate failing components, and I ruthlessly rip them out. Now, I was going to do it to them. I had a critical choice to make. I could pull Evan out of the shadows right now, march him into an American embassy, and declare him alive to the world. But doing so would instantly trigger the vast, well-funded network that had already tried to vaporize him once. It would turn us both into massive, highly visible targets before we had the legal ammunition to strike back. Or, I could use the greatest weapon they had unwittingly handed me, my own invisibility. I turned to Evan. The air in the room was thick with tension. I told him we were not going home together. He was going to stay right here, hiding in the dust and the misery of this border town triage center. Sloane and I would fly back to Colorado Springs alone. I was going to step right back into the meticulously crafted role they had assigned me. I would be the devastated, exhausted, perfectly compliant widow. I would let them comfort me with their false sympathies. I would let them think they had won the game. I would use my heavy mourning as an impenetrable camouflage to walk right through their front doors and locate the structural weak points of their empire. We stood by the heavy wooden doors of the chapel as the gray morning light began to bleed through the shattered stained glass windows. Evan reached out and desperately grabbed my hand. I let him hold it, but my grip was entirely devoid of warmth. I looked him dead in the eyes. I told him that I did not forgive him for the 90 days of absolute hell he had condemned me to. I was not ready to simply fall back into his arms and be his wife again. The man I married died the day I received that flag, and the man standing before me was a stranger covered in ghosts. But I was more than ready to go to war for him. I was going to return to our quiet, manicured neighborhood, and I was going to methodically, ruthlessly destroy every single person who had built a fortune on his fake grave. Stepping off the plane in Denver felt like walking onto a theater stage where I was the only actor who knew the script was a lie. I wrapped my heavy wool coat tightly around my shoulders, letting the exhaustion of international travel mask the lethal, burning focus behind my eyes. I was no longer a grieving wife. I was an architect of ruin. My first performance began less than 24 hours after my return. Grant Moore arrived at my house unannounced, carrying a lukewarm coffee and a leather briefcase. I answered the door wearing oversized sweatpants and a hollow, vacant stare. I invited him into the kitchen, the very room where he had first pressured me about the payouts. He sat across from me and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the granite island. He explained, with a perfectly manufactured tone of deep familial concern, that placing Evan's life insurance benefits into a newly established family trust would shield me from tax liabilities and the burden of financial management during my mourning period. I kept my hands trembling just enough to sell the illusion. I traced the edge of the paper and whispered that I was so tired, that I just wanted the paperwork to be over. The relief that washed over his face was absolutely visceral. His shoulders dropped. He eagerly leaned forward, offering me his pen, practically vibrating with the anticipation of a $2 million payday. I told him I needed one night to read it over, just to feel like I was doing my part. He agreed, trying to mask his desperate impatience, but his eyes betrayed him. He needed that money moved immediately. He was completely terrified of a delay. The next morning, I returned to my office at Ridgeline Civic Systems. I shut the heavy glass door, pulled the blinds, and turned my workstation into a hunting ground. My entire career was built on tracing invisible supply chain data and exposing logistical discrepancies. Hiding a digital footprint from me was like trying to hide a blazing fire in a pitch-black room. I ran the IP address Sloan had pulled from our compromised email account through a series of deep routing diagnostics. It was not a random hacker. The ping originated from a static, commercial server located in a high-rise building in downtown Denver. I cross-referenced the registry and pulled the lease agreements. The suite belonged to a boutique private law firm specializing in high-stakes military compensation and federal casualty claims. I dug into their public court filings and corporate registry connections. What I found was a coincidence so profoundly dirty it made my stomach turn. This exact law firm was currently representing Grant Moore in a seemingly routine estate planning adjustment. Simultaneously, they were listed as the retained legal counsel for Brandt Mercer Defense Logistics in a series of obscure corporate tax restructuring filings. The very people handling my husband's death benefits were sharing a boardroom with the corporation that orchestrated his assassination. My phone buzzed against the desk. It was Sloan. She had spent the last 3 days leveraging her extensive network of local media contacts, specifically a friend who worked as an investigative reporter for a regional business journal. She spoke in a rapid, hushed tone. Nolan Price, the executive at Brandt Mercer Defense Logistics and Grant's old college friend, had just closed a cash purchase on a sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate in the exclusive Cherry Creek neighborhood. The closing date was exactly 4 weeks after the military officers knocked on my door. Even more damning, public corporate filings revealed Nolan had been awarded an unprecedented, massive executive performance bonus during the exact same month Evan's team was wiped out. His promotion and his mansion were paid for with the blood of my husband. I needed a physical weapon, something undeniable. I logged into the central insurance portal using the credentials Grant had so helpfully provided. I requested the complete, raw data packet of the payout file, specifically asking for the metadata logs of every signed document. It took me 3 hours of meticulous parsing to find the anomaly. Buried deep within the 50-page digital portfolio was a supplementary addendum. It officially surrendered my status as the primary beneficiary, redirecting the funds directly into the Moore Family Trust. And at the bottom of the page was my digital signature. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering a cold, steady rhythm. I had never seen that document in my life. I checked the exact timestamp of the digital signature. It was dated a Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the casualty notification. On that specific afternoon, I had been heavily sedated, lying completely incapacitated in my bedroom while Evan's mother sat downstairs, supposedly guarding my peace. Someone had forged my authorization while I was asleep in my own home. That evening, I drove to my mother-in-law's house. I sat on her floral sofa, clutching a mug of tea, playing The Broken Bird to perfection. I let a few tears spill over my eyelashes and whispered that I was feeling overwhelmed by the legal paperwork, that I felt like people were rushing me. I watched her hands. Her fingers spasmed around her teacup. She refused to meet my gaze. I gently pressed harder, asking if Grant had seemed stressed lately. The silence stretched until it finally snapped. She broke down, her composure crumbling into ugly, gasping sobs. But it was not a confession of murder. It was a confession of profound, sickening cowardice. She admitted that 2 days after the military visit, she had received an anonymous, blocked phone call. A distorted voice told her that there were complications regarding the combat zone, and that if she wanted her remaining son to stay safe and out of federal crosshairs, she needed to ensure the family quietly accepted the official narrative without asking a single question. She had known something was terribly wrong, but instead of fighting for the truth of her dead son, she chose to protect her living one. She chose silence. She allowed Grant to rummage through my life, knowing he was entangled in something dark, simply to keep the peace. The betrayal was incredibly toxic. It was not just about greed. It was about the horrific, quiet complicity of people who simply turn their heads away when the truth is too dangerous to look at. I did not comfort her. I let her cry alone, realizing that my marriage had been surrounded by cowards. I left her house and drove straight to a 24-hour diner on the edge of the interstate. I opened a burner phone I had purchased with cash and dialed a number I had memorized from my corporate vetting days. I needed a ghost. I hired Tessa Vale. Tessa was a ruthless former federal financial investigator who had been pushed out of the agency for being too aggressive. She now made her living privately hunting down phantom federal contractors and exposing fraudulent supply lines. I wired her a massive retainer fee using a private, untraceable savings account I had maintained since before I ever met Evan. Nobody in his family knew the money existed. I sat in the dim light of the diner booth, staring out at the rain-slicked highway. The entire grotesque network was finally illuminated. They had used a staged military disaster to cover up a monumental embezzlement ring. They utilized a corrupt law firm to legally bind the stolen money. They relied on a greedy brother to manipulate a grieving widow, and a terrified mother to ensure total silence. They had built a perfect, impenetrable lid over their crimes, but they made one fatal, arrogant miscalculation. They assumed the widow was too broken to look underneath. They were entirely wrong. I was going to bury them all. I sat in the pale glow of my monitor, drafting the official fraud complaint regarding my forged digital signature. To make the dossier absolutely airtight, I needed to ensure no other financial anomalies existed in the periphery of my life. I logged into an old, largely dormant joint checking account Evan and I had opened during our first year of marriage. It held barely $500. I had not looked at the balance in over 14 months. But the server access log told a completely different, highly alarming story. Someone had successfully logged into that specific account exactly 48 hours after the military officers visited my home. The login did not route through a masked overseas proxy or a sophisticated encrypted network. It pinged from a standard residential internet service provider located right here in Colorado Springs. I cross-referenced the raw IP address with the digital footprint left on the insurance portal from the forged addendum. It was a flawless, undeniable match. It was Grant, my brother-in-law, the man who had stood in my kitchen and offered his shoulder for me to cry on, had been quietly rifling through my dead husband's financial drawers before his memorial service even took place. The next morning, Tessa Vale slid a thick manila folder across the sticky laminate table of a diner on the edge of town. She did not bother with pleasantries or sympathetic glances. She instructed me to look at the highlighted bank transfers on the second page. It was a chaotic, deliberately confusing web of wire routing numbers, but at the absolute center was a massive payment originating from a shell corporation controlled by Nolan Price. The money flowed rapidly through 3 different offshore accounts before landing in a domestic limited liability company registered entirely under the name of Grant's wife. The stated purpose of the $250,000 wire transfer was broadly listed as logistics consulting services. Grant's wife was a kindergarten teacher. She knew absolutely nothing about international military logistics. Tessa laid out the brutal timeline, tracing her finger along the dates. Grant received the first half of the money exactly 2 weeks before Evan deployed into the combat zone. He received the second half exactly 3 days after the casualty report was officially filed. The air in my lungs turned to cold ash. Grant had not simply discovered the fraud after the fact and decided to profit from the cover-up. He was an active, foundational part of the machinery. He knew Evan had found the massive discrepancies in the supply chains, and instead of warning his own brother, instead of standing by his blood, Grant had sold his brother's operational movements to Nolan Price. He traded Evan's exact location and scheduled deployment coordinates for a seat at the corporate table and $250,000. The most nauseating part of the revelation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Grant had absolutely no idea Evan had survived the blast. Grant truly, entirely believed that Evan was a charred corpse inside a closed military casket. He had looked me directly in the eyes, hugged me tightly at the funeral, and urged me to secure my future, fully believing he had signed his own brother's death warrant. My stomach violently heaved. I stumbled to the restroom of the diner, gripping the edge of the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned stark white, dry heaving into the cold basin. This was no longer just a sprawling story of corporate greed and stolen defense budgets. It was a horrific, intimate story of a brother selling his own flesh and blood for a bigger house and a promotion. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was suffocating. A weaker woman would have walked straight from that diner to the nearest police station. She would have thrown the bank statements on a detective's desk and demanded Grant be arrested immediately. But my mind was operating on a completely different, much colder frequency. If I cut off the tail, the head of the snake would easily slither away into the tall grass. Nolan Price and the untouchable executives at Brandt Mercer Defense Logistics would simply claim Grant acted entirely alone. They would sever their ties, burn the paperwork, and hide permanently behind their armies of expensive corporate lawyers. I needed the entire chain to shatter simultaneously. I needed them all to fall into the exact same grave. I called Grant that afternoon. I kept my voice weak, breathy, and completely soaked in manufactured grief. I told him I was finally ready to sign the trust transfer documents, but I needed him to come over to my house to explain one of the complicated legal clauses. He arrived less than 30 minutes later, smelling of expensive cologne and practically vibrating with barely concealed triumph. He thought he had successfully crossed the finish line. He believed the irritating, grieving widow was finally falling into line and surrendering control. I invited him into the living room. I had already placed my phone face down on the glass coffee table, the voice memo application silently recording every single breath drawn in the room. I handed him a glass of cold water and picked up the thick stack of legal papers. I began to ask him mundane, intentionally pointless questions about tax brackets and beneficiary percentages, carefully lulling him into a false sense of absolute security. He played his part perfectly, adopting the tone of a patient, protective guardian. Then, I smoothly shifted the narrative trajectory. I stared blindly at the paperwork and let my voice crack with perfectly timed emotion. I told him I could not stop having terrible nightmares about the blast. I intentionally dropped a highly classified detail Evan had told me in that dark chapel closet overseas. I whispered that it deeply haunted me how the communication arrays were intentionally jammed 5 minutes before the explosion, leaving the entire team completely blind and deaf. It was a highly specific, damning detail that was entirely absent from the sanitized military casualty report provided to the family. Grant took a slow sip of his water. He did not choke. He did not look surprised or confused. He simply nodded with a practiced, deeply sympathetic frown. He already knew. I pushed the blade in a little deeper. I set the papers down on my lap and looked at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I asked him if Evan had made powerful enemies. I asked him if someone had intentionally wanted Evan gone. Grant sighed heavily, adopting the deeply convincing tone of a weary older brother carrying the weight of the world. He leaned forward and placed his hand over mine. He told me that I needed to let the conspiracy theories go for the sake of my own mental health. He spoke clearly, and my phone recorded every single clear, damning syllable. He told me that Evan dug way too deep into things that were absolutely none of his business. He stated that Evan could never just leave well enough alone, and that everything was cleaned up a long time ago. He squeezed my hand tightly and explicitly warned me that digging for a truth that did not exist would only hurt me, and that signing the papers today was the only guaranteed way to ensure I was permanently protected from the fallout. He had just explicitly confessed to having prior knowledge of Evan's investigation into the company. He actively admitted the crime scene was intentionally cleaned up to hide the truth. He threatened me under the thin, fragile guise of family protection. I pulled my hand out from under his grip, picked up the black pen, and signed my name on the very bottom of the blank signature page. It absolutely did not matter. The document was fraudulent anyway, and I had already flagged the account. I handed the heavy stack back to him. He smiled, a wide, deeply relieved expression spreading across his face. He walked out of my front door, entirely oblivious to the fact that he had just confessed to a federal crime on tape. I walked over to the door and locked the heavy brass deadbolt behind him. I picked up my phone from the glass table, stopped the audio recording, and immediately saved the digital file to 3 separate, highly encrypted cloud servers. For the very first time since the men in uniform arrived on my front porch in the rain, I held a tangible, undeniable weapon. I had absolute, recorded proof of deliberate, calculated betrayal originating from inside my own family. The decision was finally firm in my mind, and I was ready to begin. I stood in the center of my living room, the audio recording of my brother-in-law safely backed up across 3 separate encrypted servers. I truly believed I had finally seen the absolute edges of the board. I had identified the corrupt corporation, the ruthless executive, and the traitorous family member. The intricate puzzle of my husband's staged death felt entirely complete. I had the weapon I needed to tear them all down, but the architecture of a massive, multi-million-dollar lie is rarely that simple. It is constructed in deep, hidden layers, and I was about to violently crash through another one. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of a light drizzle against the living room windows. I was sitting on the rug, surrounded by printed bank statements, when I heard a soft, distinct slide of paper against hardwood. I froze instantly. I held my breath, listening to the heavy silence of the house, before walking slowly toward the front entryway. Lying perfectly flat on the dark floorboards, pushed deliberately through the narrow gap beneath the heavy oak door, was a plain manila envelope. I unlocked the deadbolt and threw the door open, stepping out onto the wet porch. The suburban street was entirely empty. The glowing amber streetlights illuminated nothing but falling rain and empty parked cars. Whoever had dropped it was already gone. I brought the envelope back inside and carried it to the kitchen counter. I used a paring knife to slice the seal. There was no letterhead, no postage, and absolutely no return address. Inside, there was only a small, silver thumb drive and a single, torn piece of lined paper. The handwriting on the paper was jagged and hurried. It contained exactly 2 sentences. Do not trust the one calling themselves a fixer. There is one more. A cold shiver raced down my spine. I took the silver drive to my home office and plugged it into an isolated, offline laptop I had purchased with cash specifically for this investigation. The drive contained a single video file. I clicked play. The footage was grainy, stripped of any audio, and stamped with a digital time code in the bottom right corner. The date indicated the recording was captured exactly 4 days after the military officers had knocked on my front door. The camera angle suggested a high mounting point, looking down over a massive industrial loading bay. The warehouse walls were lined with towering metal shelves, but I immediately recognized the corporate logo painted on the concrete floor. It was a regional distribution center for Brant Mercer Defense Logistics. In the center of the frame, a man in a tailored charcoal suit was pacing nervously. Even from the elevated, distorted angle, I easily recognized the arrogant posture and slicked back hair of Nolan Price. He was waiting for someone. A minute later, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the loading dock. It was a woman wearing a dark trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her face. She walked briskly toward Nolan. They did not shake hands. They stood close together for less than 30 seconds before Nolan reached inside his suit jacket, produced a thick white envelope, and handed it to her. She shoved it into her coat pocket and immediately turned to leave. I paused the video. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I rewound the footage and played it again at quarter speed. The angle was terrible, specifically chosen to obscure faces, but as the woman turned sharply to walk away, she passed directly in front of a glass-enclosed foreman's office. For a fraction of a second, the harsh overhead fluorescent lights caught her profile in the window's reflection. I paused the frame. I zoomed in, magnifying the pixels until the image began to degrade, but the structural lines of her face were unmistakable. The slope of her jaw, the specific way she carried her right shoulder, the silver pendant flashing briefly at her neck. The air vanished completely from my lungs. I fell back into my desk chair, clutching my chest as if I had been physically shot. It was Marina Cole. Marina was my oldest, closest friend. We had known each other for over a decade. When the military brought me the news of the explosion, Marina was the very first person I called. She had practically moved into my house for the first 3 months of my mourning. She slept on my living room sofa. She brewed my coffee every single morning. She held my hair while I threw up from sheer panic. And most devastatingly, she was the one who sat beside me at this exact dining table, gently guiding my shaking hands as I filled out the endless stacks of military survivor benefit forms and private insurance claims. I did not want to believe it. My brain violently rejected the visual evidence. I grabbed my burner phone and immediately dialed Tessa Vale. I woke her up at 3 a.m. and demanded she run a complete, exhaustive forensic audit on Marina's financial history. I needed to know every single dollar that had moved in or out of her accounts over the last 12 months. I spent the next 48 hours living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for Tessa's report. When she finally slid the dossier across a table at a secluded coffee shop, the truth was an ugly, undeniable absolute. Marina had been drowning. Her boutique marketing firm had completely collapsed under the weight of a massive, devastating civil lawsuit earlier that year. She was facing imminent bankruptcy and the loss of her home. But miraculously, exactly 2 weeks after my husband was declared dead, a wire transfer of $150,000 hit her primary account. It was routed through a series of anonymous limited liability companies, but Tessa traced the origin point back to the same corporate umbrella controlled by Nolan Price. Marina's debts were instantly zeroed out. I realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that the people who orchestrated this massive cover-up did not just want to bury their embezzlement scheme, they desperately needed a cooperative, compliant widow. They needed me to quickly and quietly sign the legal documents to legitimize the insurance payouts and officially close the federal file. Marina was not there to comfort me. She was paid to be my handler. I needed her to confess on my terms. I called Marina that afternoon, keeping my voice fragile and entirely devoid of energy. I invited her over to the house, claiming I was having a terrible mental breakdown and needed my best friend. She arrived within 20 minutes, carrying a bottle of my favorite red wine and wearing a mask of profound, practiced sympathy. We sat at the granite kitchen island. I poured the wine, my hands intentionally shaking, and looked at her with exhausted, tear-filled eyes. I told her that I was completely giving up. I lied and said the legal fight was too exhausting. The memories in the house were too painful, and I had decided to sell the property, pack whatever I could carry, and leave the state by the end of the month. Her reaction was immediate and entirely unnatural. Instead of offering comfort or asking where I planned to go, her eyes darted toward the hallway. She leaned across the marble counter, her voice dropping into a tone of urgent curiosity. She casually asked what I planned to do with all of Evan's old military crates and hard drives. She pressed me for exact details, asking which storage facility I would use, what specific day the movers were scheduled to arrive, and if I had recently found any locked files I needed help sorting through before the move. She was actively probing for loose ends. She was checking to see if I had stumbled across the encrypted payload Evan had tried to send. I stopped acting. I set my wine glass down with a sharp, heavy thud against the granite. I reached into the manila folder resting on the stool beside me and pulled out the printed, magnified screenshots from the warehouse security footage. I slid them across the counter, right next to her hand. Then, I placed the detailed bank records Tessa had acquired directly on top of the photos. I watched the exact moment her soul left her body, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. She stared at the $150,000 wire transfer, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. "You were the one who logged into the old shared email account," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying whisper. "You were the one sitting at my dining table, making sure I signed the right boxes so Nolan Price could get away with murder." She completely shattered. She collapsed over the kitchen island, burying her face in her hands, sobbing with a frantic, ugly desperation. She swore she knew absolutely nothing about the explosion or the stolen military equipment. She claimed Nolan had simply approached her when she was desperate, telling her that Evan was involved in some shady corporate espionage and that the company needed to make sure the widow did not stir up unnecessary public relations trouble. She confessed that she was paid strictly to monitor my mental state, to intercept any strange communications, and to ensure I signed the insurance releases without asking questions. She sat in my kitchen, the very room where she had held me while I cried over a dead man, and admitted that every single cup of tea she brewed was a calculated act of espionage. I did not yell. I did not throw my glass at the wall. The betrayal was so profound, so deeply intimate, that it completely bypassed anger and settled into a cold, terrifying void. I realized that my grief had been weaponized against me in my own home. I had been monitored and manipulated while I was bleeding out on the floor. I looked at the weeping woman who used to be my sister by choice, and I knew exactly how I was going to use her to burn their entire world to the ground. The architecture of absolute destruction requires a foundation of perfect discipline. I could not simply walk into a police precinct with my fragmented recordings and financial anomalies. That approach would only sever the weakest limbs of the conspiracy, allowing the core entity to survive, adapt, and ultimately crush me under a mountain of expensive corporate litigation. To truly obliterate Brant Mercer Defense Logistics and the people who sold my husband for executive bonuses, we needed a strategy that attacked them from every conceivable angle. We transformed my secure home office into a subterranean war room. Through heavily encrypted, untraceable satellite uplinks, Evan became a digital ghost, feeding us the structural vulnerabilities of the corporate network from his hiding place overseas. Together with Sloan and Tessa, we engineered a flawless, three-tiered protocol designed to trap our enemies in a cage entirely of their own making. The strategy was categorized into financial, legal, and media warfare. We needed to ensure that once the trap was sprung, they would have absolutely no capacity to buy their way out, legislate their way out, or spin the narrative in the court of public opinion. But to maneuver them onto our battlefield, I had to convince them that I was completely surrendering on theirs. I deployed my very first weapon. I used Marina. She was utterly broken, terrified of federal prison, and desperate to buy back a fraction of her own soul. I instructed her to contact Nolan Price directly on his private cellular line. She was to deliver a highly specific, carefully manufactured narrative. She told him that the widow was finally collapsing under the psychological weight of the tragedy. She reported that I was actively packing my belongings, crying uncontrollably for hours, and talking frantically about wanting the entire nightmare to simply disappear. Marina told him I was terrified of a lengthy legal battle over the life insurance and was desperately seeking a quiet, confidential settlement just to close the door on my past and disappear from Colorado entirely. It was the exact bait a corporate predator could not resist. Nolan wanted a legally binding non-disclosure agreement signed in blood, and he thought I was practically begging him for the pen. While Nolan and Grant were busy gloating over my fabricated surrender, Tessa was quietly arming the legal landmines. She compiled a devastating, comprehensive dossier containing the forged signatures, the offshore wire transfers to Grant's wife, and the encrypted supply chain discrepancies Evan had managed to salvage. But she did not take it to the local authorities. Instead, she bypassed the standard chain of command entirely and delivered the sealed files directly to the private residence of a notoriously aggressive state senator. This specific senator had built an entire political career ruthlessly dismantling fraudulent defense contractors. Tessa also routed a secondary package to the independent inspector general of the Defense Department. These actions created an invisible, impenetrable shield around me. If Brant Mercer Defense Logistics realized I was hunting them and attempted to silence me, the federal investigations would automatically detonate, tearing their entire corporate structure apart from the top down. Simultaneously, Sloan was preparing the final strike. She utilized her most trusted contacts in the investigative journalism sector to construct a massive, highly detailed multimedia exposé. She built an encrypted website loaded with the warehouse surveillance footage, the audio recordings of Grant, and the financial ledgers. The site was linked to a dead man's switch. It was programmed to automatically publish and syndicate to every major news outlet in the country if Sloan did not physically enter a cancellation password every 12 hours. We had successfully guaranteed that our story could never be killed with a single phone call or a dark alley threat. With the explosive charges quietly set in the background, I accepted the formal invitation to negotiate. Nolan Price's elite legal team arranged the meeting at an incredibly exclusive, privately owned mountain resort located 2 hours outside the city limits. It was a location specifically chosen to intimidate, a fortress of mahogany, leather, and immense wealth designed to make a grieving widow feel incredibly small and entirely powerless. I arrived in the back of a black car, stepping out into the crisp mountain air. I had meticulously prepared my physical appearance for this exact performance. I wore an oversized, heavy-knit sweater that made my frame look frail and diminished. I wore absolutely no makeup, allowing the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes to remain highly visible. I kept my shoulders slumped, my gaze constantly dropping to the floor, and I allowed my hands to maintain a subtle, constant tremor. I walked into the sprawling, glass-walled boardroom, looking exactly like a woman who had nothing left to fight for. Nolan Price sat at the head of the massive polished table, flanked by 3 identical lawyers in pristine, bespoke suits. Grant sat near the middle, attempting to project an aura of brotherly support while failing to hide the greedy anticipation burning in his eyes. I took my seat at the opposite end, shrinking into the heavy leather chair. The lead lawyer slid a thick bound document across the gleaming wood. It was a comprehensive settlement agreement offering an absolutely staggering $8 million, legally categorized as a corporate grievance payout. But the money was entirely irrelevant. The true value of the document was buried in the fine print. It contained an ironclad, permanent non-disclosure clause. By signing it, I would legally admit that the military casualty report was the sole, undisputed truth, and I would be permanently barred from ever filing a future lawsuit or speaking publicly about my husband's deployment. I touched the edge of the paper, my fingers shaking violently. I looked up at Nolan, letting a tear spill over my lashes. I whispered that I just wanted the pain to stop. I told him the memories were suffocating me and I needed absolute peace. My display of profound weakness fed his monumental arrogance. Nolan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, entirely unable to suppress his triumphant smirk. He looked at me not as a human being, but as a minor logistical error he had successfully managed to correct. He dismissed his lawyers from the immediate conversation with a flick of his wrist, wanting to personally deliver the final, crushing blow. He looked directly into my eyes and adopted a smooth, patronizing tone. He told me that the world is a highly complicated machine, and sometimes the gears catch things they are not supposed to. He said that looking for villains in a tragedy is a natural stage of grief, but it is ultimately a destructive waste of time. And then, feeling completely untouchable in his private mountain fortress, he let his mask slip a fraction of an inch. He leaned forward and softly stated that the brutal truth sometimes hurts far more innocent people than a well-managed, carefully contained lie. I kept my head down, but inside, my blood was practically humming. He was arrogant, heavily intoxicated by his own perceived power. I glanced over at Grant. My brother-in-law was physically exhaling, his shoulders dropping in a massive, visible wave of relief. Grant genuinely believed this was the absolute end of the road. He thought this signature was the final lock on the door, the very last time they would ever have to control the widow. Everything was perfectly positioned. The trap was armed, the federal shields were active, and the media bomb was ticking. But as I picked up the heavy gold pen they had provided, I knew I could not end the game right there. I kept my hand hovering above the signature line, a horrifying realization crystallizing in my mind. I had Nolan admitting to a well-managed lie. I had Grant confessing to a cover-up. But neither of those things explicitly tied them to the physical act of murder. In a court of law, a brilliant defense attorney could argue those statements were simply ruthless corporate maneuvering regarding the embezzlement, completely detached from the actual explosion that wiped out the tactical team. I was holding a devastating hand of cards, but I was missing the single most important piece. I needed an undeniable recorded confession that bound Nolan Price directly to the coordination of the fatal blast. I needed him to admit he ordered the hit. I let my hand violently tremble, dropping the gold pen onto the mahogany table with a loud clatter. I covered my face with my hands and let out a broken, pathetic sob. Pushing the document away, I told them I was too overwhelmed, too panicked to read the legal jargon right now. I told them I needed just a little more time to breathe. Grant looked panicked, but Nolan simply sighed, annoyed by the delay but entirely confident he still owned me. I stood up, fragile and shaking, and walked out of the boardroom. I had not failed. I was simply resetting the board for the final, fatal maneuver. The night before, I was scheduled to return to the mountain resort and sign my life away. The encrypted burner phone resting on my nightstand vibrated violently against the wood. It was past 2 a.m. I answered it in the pitch-black room, expecting Tessa to have found another offshore account. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to a ghost who was supposed to be hiding across the globe. Evan had returned to American soil. He had not come back to beg for my forgiveness or to hide in my basement. He came back because he had spent the last 2 weeks hunting down a rumor buried deep in the encrypted civilian channels, and he had finally caught his prey. He had found a second survivor. His name was Luis Doran. He was a former communications technician attached to the same doomed tactical operation. Luis had not been thrown clear of the blast like Evan. He had been stationed at a remote relay outpost 2 miles away from the primary kill zone. When the explosives detonated, Luis saw the raw data stream on his monitors. He knew instantly that the coordinates had been deliberately altered, effectively trapping the unit in a dead-end canyon. But before Luis could sound the alarm, he was intercepted by a private extraction team. He was quietly brought back to the United States, forced under the threat of death to sign a brutal non-disclosure agreement, given a new identity, and handed a massive sum of hush money. He was told the entire unit was dead, and that his silence was the only thing keeping him breathing. But Luis was a technician. He did not just walk away. He secretly downloaded the final 60 seconds of the internal communications relay before they wiped his servers. Evan transmitted the audio file to my secure laptop. I sat on my bed, shivering in the cold night air, and pressed play. Through the heavy static and the chaotic shouting of men realizing they were walking into an ambush, a single, calm, chillingly familiar voice cut through the radio channel. Lock the extraction route and let the casualty report handle the rest. I forwarded the file to Tessa immediately. Within an hour, she called me back. She had run the audio through military-grade spectral analysis software. The voice print was a 98% match to Nolan Price. It was the smoking gun. It was the definitive proof of premeditated murder. But Tessa warned me that in a high-stakes federal trial, a 98% match on a highly compressed, illegally obtained audio file from a corrupted server could be challenged by a team of $2,000 an hour defense attorneys. We needed to push that match to a flawless 100%. We needed Nolan's raw, unfiltered vocal cadence recorded in a perfectly controlled acoustic environment, reacting directly to his own crime. I did not go to the mountain resort the next morning. Exactly 2 hours before the meeting, I sent a frantic, highly erratic email to Nolan's lead counsel. I played the role of the deeply paranoid, traumatized widow to absolute perfection. I told them I had suffered a massive panic attack on the highway. I refused to drive to an isolated cabin in the woods. I demanded the venue be changed to their corporate law headquarters in downtown Denver. I explicitly stated that I needed the comfort of professional security, hallway cameras, and a legally licensed notary present in the room, or I was not going to sign a single page. It was a massive logistical headache for them, but Nolan was too arrogant and too desperate to close the file to say no. He agreed. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I was walking through the gleaming, sterile lobby of the law firm. I wore a hidden, high-fidelity microphone taped securely beneath my blouse, broadcasting a live encrypted feed directly to Tessa, who was parked in a surveillance van 3 blocks away. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The conference room was a massive expanse of cold glass and polished steel, offering a panoramic view of the city. It was an environment designed for ultimate control. Nolan Price was already sitting at the table, checking his heavy silver watch, visibly irritated by the venue change. Grant was sitting next to him, sweating profusely, his knee bouncing nervously under the table. 3 corporate lawyers stood by the window, holding the newly printed settlement agreements. I took my seat slowly. I kept my hands folded on my lap, my eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood. The lead lawyer placed the contract in front of me and handed me a heavy fountain pen. He began droning on about the finality of the agreement, the disbursement schedule, and the strict confidentiality clauses. I let him talk for exactly 3 minutes. I let the tension build in the room until Grant was practically hyperventilating with anticipation. I picked up the pen. I held it over the signature line. Then, I stopped. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into Nolan Price's eyes. I stripped every ounce of weakness, every trace of the grieving widow. Completely out of my posture, my spine straightened. My voice dropped its fragile tremor and became cold, sharp, and entirely steady. "Before I sign this," I said, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls, "I have one final question about the logistics of the settlement. How exactly did you factor Luis Doran into the financial forecast?" The impact of that name was instantaneous and devastating. For exactly half a second, the untouchable corporate executive vanished. Nolan Price's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray, his jaw locked. His eyes widened slightly as his brain violently short-circuited. desperately trying to process how a suburban widow knew the name of a deeply buried ghost. That split second of absolute terror was all the confirmation I needed. In the surveillance van down the street, Tessa's recording software registered the spike. We had him. But the true explosion did not come from Nolan. It came from the man sitting next to him. The name Luis Doran meant nothing to Grant, but the look of pure, unadulterated panic on Nolan's face was a language Grant spoke fluently. The immense pressure of the past 4 months, the guilt of selling his brother, and the terrifying realization that the cover-up was unraveling completely shattered Grant's fragile psychological state. Grant slammed his hands onto the table, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He turned to Nolan, his face flushed dark red, spit flying from his lips. "What is she talking about?" Grant screamed, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "Who is Luis Doran? You told me you had this entirely under control. You looked me in the eye and swore you were just going to teach Evan to keep his mouth shut. You said you would isolate him and ruin his clearance. You never said a single word about wiping out the whole damn unit." The entire room froze. The 3 corporate lawyers stopped breathing. The air in the conference room turned to solid ice. Nolan leaped out of his chair, his veneer of professional sophistication completely incinerated. "Shut your pathetic mouth, you stupid coward," Nolan roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at Grant's chest. "You took the money. You gave me his deployment grid. You do not get to complain about the cleanup process now." I sat perfectly still, listening to the beautiful, chaotic symphony of their mutual destruction. Grant had just confessed to providing the tactical coordinates. Nolan had just confessed to executing the cleanup process, and every single pristine, acoustically perfect syllable was captured by the microphone taped to my chest. I calmly stood up. I placed the fountain pen down on the unsigned contract. "Thank you, gentlemen," I said, my voice cutting through their shouting match like a razor blade. "I think we are entirely finished here." I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors. "Do not let her leave," Nolan shouted, his voice high and frantic. The lead lawyer, acting on pure, desperate instinct, lunged toward the wall panel. He slammed his hand against a red security button. A heavy electronic deadbolt engaged with a loud, final click, securely locking the conference room doors from the inside. The 3 lawyers moved quickly, physically blocking my path to the exit. Nolan stood at the end of the table, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a lethal cornered desperation. He thought he could trap me. He thought he could terrify me into surrendering the evidence. He was entirely wrong. I did not scream. I did not back away. I simply checked the face of my watch. It was exactly 1:15 in the afternoon. "You really should have checked the hallway cameras before you locked yourselves in here," I said quietly, offering him a cold, hollow smile. I had not just demanded this location for the acoustics. I chose it because of the strict access control. When I walked into the lobby downstairs, Tessa sent a heavily encrypted, automated message containing the entire dossier, the audio files, the financial wires, and my exact GPS location to our assembled strike team. The message operated on a strict 15-minute delay. If I did not walk out of this specific conference room and manually enter a cancellation code on my phone by 1:14, the delay expired. Through the thick, soundproof glass of the conference room walls, Nolan looked out into the main corridor of his prestigious law firm. The elevator doors at the end of the hall slid open. They did not come quietly. A small army stepped out onto the polished marble floors. There were federal agents from the Inspector General's office wearing dark tactical vests. There were independent forensic accountants carrying steel briefcases. And flanking them, armed with heavy cameras and bright flashing lights, were 3 different investigative journalists Sloan had personally escorted into the building. Nolan Price watched his entire empire burn to ashes through a pane of locked glass. He slowly turned around and looked at me, realizing far too late that the woman he thought was a grieving pawn had just permanently checkmated the entire board. The lead lawyer's hands were shaking so violently, he missed the keypad buttons twice before finally disengaging the electronic deadbolt. The heavy glass doors of the conference room slid open, and the suffocating, contained atmosphere of the corporate fortress instantly evaporated. A flood of federal agents wearing dark tactical vests poured into the room, followed closely by independent forensic auditors carrying steel briefcases. Behind them, a flurry of camera flashes erupted from the investigative journalists Sloan had strategically positioned in the hallway. Nolan Price immediately attempted to deploy his final, desperate line of defense. He adjusted his silk tie, forced his facial muscles into a mask of calm, professional concern, and held up his hands toward the lead federal investigator. He smoothly declared that the sudden intrusion was entirely unnecessary. He called the entire situation a tragic, highly emotional misunderstanding, claiming he was simply trying to finalize a grievance payout for a deeply traumatized, hysterical widow who was clearly suffering from severe paranoid delusions. Then, the crowd of tactical vests parted down the middle. Evan walked into the room. The silence that slammed into the conference room was absolute and deafening. It was a heavy physical force that sucked the remaining oxygen straight out of the air. Grant stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping against the hardwood floor until his spine violently hit the glass wall. His eyes bulged in unadulterated, primal horror, looking at his brother exactly as if a rotting corpse had just crawled out of a grave and stepped into a high-rise office. Nolan Price dropped his mask. For the very first time since I discovered his name in a hidden ledger, the untouchable executive looked utterly, helplessly human. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white. His mouth hung open, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He stared at the dead man breathing his air, realizing in one catastrophic fraction of a second that his millions of dollars and armies of lawyers were completely useless. Evan did not shout. He did not lunge across the table to wrap his hands around Nolan's throat. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing directly across the mahogany table from the men who had ordered his execution. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the heavy, matte black titanium wedding watch that had been missing from his memorial box, and dropped it onto the polished wood. The metal struck the table with a loud, ringing thud that made Grant physically flinch. Evan looked dead into Nolan's terrified eyes and stated, with glacial clarity, that he had never died in that valley. He had been systematically erased because he had seen the ghost ledgers, the inflated supply routes, and the embezzlement of millions of dollars of tactical gear. He had been marked for death the exact moment he tried to blow the whistle, before Nolan's highly paid lawyers could utter a single objection. Tessa Vale stepped through the doorway. She was not alone. Walking beside her, looking thin but fiercely resolute, was Luis Doran. When Nolan saw the former communications technician, his knees literally buckled, forcing him to grip the edge of the table to stay standing. Luis did not look at Nolan. He looked directly at the federal investigators and began speaking. He confirmed every single horrific detail of the massacre. He detailed the specific chain of command that issued the false coordinates. He confirmed the deliberate locking of the tactical extraction routes. And he described, in chilling detail, how the private cleanup squads had hunted the survivors through the burning wreckage to ensure absolutely no one came back to tell the story. The trap slammed completely shut. The combined weight of the evidence formed an unliftable boulder that instantly crushed them. Tessa handed the lead inspector the full dossier containing the manipulated financial data, the forged digital signatures on my insurance policies, the $250,000 wired through shell companies to Grant's wife, and the banking records proving Marina was paid to spy on me in my own home. And tying it all together was the pristine encrypted audio file Tessa had just pulled from the microphone currently taped to my chest, featuring Nolan and Grant confessing to the entire cover-up less than 10 minutes ago. Federal agents moved in immediately. They grabbed Grant first, slamming his chest against the polished table and pulling his arms violently behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the room was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. Grant was placed under immediate arrest for complicity in federal fraud, wire fraud, and severe obstruction of justice. He began sobbing hysterically, begging Evan to look at him, Screaming that he did not know about the kill order, Evan simply turned his back on him, refusing to offer a single shred of absolution. Nolan Price and his primary executive links were formally charged right there on the 42nd floor. The lead investigator read off a devastating litany of charges, including massive corporate embezzlement, document forgery, obstruction of justice, and the active concealment of evidence in a staged, premeditated mass assassination. The camera shutters fired in a blinding, continuous wave as the untouchable architect of my misery was frog-marched out of his own boardroom in chains. Later that afternoon, the shockwaves of the arrests violently tore through our quiet, manicured neighborhood. I stood on the front lawn of my house as federal seizure teams raided Grant's property 3 blocks away. My mother-in-law pulled her car onto my driveway, stepping out onto the concrete. She did not look shocked. When the news broke that her son Evan was alive and her other son was heading to federal prison, she did not gasp in disbelief. Instead, her legs simply gave out. She collapsed onto the cold cement, burying her face in her hands, weeping with a loud, ragged agony, but I knew she was not crying out of sudden, overwhelming surprise. She was weeping because the horrific, cowardly silence she had maintained for months had finally been dragged out into the blinding sunlight. She had known the official story was a lie, and she had chosen to look away. For the very first time since I married into her family, I did not kneel down beside her. I did not place a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. I simply stood still, watching her cry, absolutely refusing to carry the suffocating weight of her guilt anymore. I was done bleeding for cowards. As the sun began to set, Evan and I finally sat alone on the back porch of the house we had bought together. The reunion between the surviving soldier and the widow who avenged him was not a cinematic fairy tale. We did not fall into a passionate embrace. We did not cry tears of overwhelming joy and pretend the nightmare was over. He was alive, but the fundamental trust that held our marriage together had been completely shredded. He had left me in the dark for 90 agonizing days, and I had become a ruthless, calculating stranger to survive it. We sat in the fading light, maintaining a careful, physical distance. We decided we were not going to simply move back into the same bedroom and pretend the blood had washed away. We agreed to start completely over, armed with nothing but the brutal truth. We committed to intensive therapy and absolute, unflinching honesty, recognizing that rebuilding our foundation might take years, and acknowledging the very real possibility that it might never be fully repaired. I walked to the front yard one last time as the streetlights flickered on. I stood in front of the house, staring at the exact spot on the porch where the men in uniform had handed me a folded flag and a monumental lie. I watched the taillights of the last federal investigation vehicle roll away down the quiet suburban street, and standing there in the cool evening air, I finally understood the truth. Revenge is not about screaming in the faces of the monsters who destroyed your reality. True revenge is surviving. It is living with enough cold, calculated lucidity to carefully pull every single layer of their deception out into the light, day by day, piece by piece, until the very lies they built to protect themselves become the ropes that choke them. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.